A natural place to begin such a discussion is with a source group called Eddic Poetry. These poems are all about the gods and heroes of Norse myth and legend. Pretty straightforward, right? Well, the problem is how we have them. The majority of them come from an Icelandic manuscript from 1270 CE, that's 220 years after the Viking Age, and 207 years after Iceland converted to Christianity. It's typically called the Poetic Edda. It's also known as the Codex Regius in Latin and Konungsbók in Icelandic, or GKS 23654TO if you're stuck in the archives. And it contains roughly 30 poems making use of a variety of meters. Despite coming to us from a 13th century manuscript though, it's generally accepted that these poems give us the closest thing to a genuine picture of Norse mythology that we have in written form. Yet despite being from a book, these poems were typically received orally, that is, read aloud and performed to an audience. As a result, some argue that these poems should actually be referred to as songs, chants, or even dramas instead, which the names of their respective meters suggest. Considering this, Eddic poetry is essentially a transition between the oral tradition of the Viking Age and a new age of written literature in medieval Iceland. They provide us with a snapshot of a fading oral tradition by later hands, which preserved with ink the memory and songs of their ancestors. However tempting it may be, though, these poems aren't actually a perfect representation of Norse mythology during the Viking Age. Their oral tradition was always changing, and regardless of how old the content truly was, the form that we have them in now was produced much later. The manuscript containing this poetry wasn't made for a pagan audience, nor was it made to preserve pagan ideologies. On the contrary, its content was likely seen as nothing more than fragments of folklore repurposed for entertainment. Much could have still been changed to suit the needs and beliefs of their own society. Nevertheless, here's an example of what we're talking about. I've picked one that touches on the same subject we began this lesson with, Gnungagap. It comes from the beginning of a poem called Voluspa, or The Prophecy of the Seeress. Heed my words, all classes of men, you greater and lesser children of Heimdall. You summoned me, Odin, to tell what I recall of the oldest deeds of gods and men. I remember the giants, born so long ago. In those ancient days they raised me. I remember 9 worlds, 9 giantesses, and the seed from which Yggdrasil sprang. It was at the very beginning. It was Ymir's time. There was no sand, no sea, no cooling waves, no earth, no sky, no grass. Just Gnungagap. But Odin and his brothers created the earth. It was they who made Midgard. The sun shone from the south upon the stones of their hall, and the land turned green with growing plant life. While Eddic poetry was always anonymous, Skaldic poetry refers to the work of a specific skald, or poet. Much more poetry of this type has survived as well. Whereas we only have about 35 poems of Eddic poetry, there are roughly 330 named poems/groupings of Skaldic poetry, and that doesn't include unnamed poetry. Before you get too excited though, most of that poetry isn't actually about Norse mythology or even heroic legend. On the contrary, most Skaldic poetry serve to praise kings and commemorate events such as battles that the skald supposedly witnessed or was recounting from personal experience. Nevertheless, Skaldic poetry still references Norse mythology fairly frequently, albeit indirectly most of the time. This was usually done through something called Kennings, which are roundabout ways of referring to people, places, or things. It's easier to explain if I offer an example though, so here's one. Instead of saying gold, a skald could say Freya's weeping, for it is known in Norse mythology that she cries tears of gold. As we'll learn in a later lecture, these kennings could get quite complicated and often required a deep familiarity with Norse mythology to understand. For example, the strong ice sheet of Rodi's roof does not diminish because of the reign of the eyes of Od's bedmate. May that king reach old age. Yeah, it's basically a complicated riddle if you're not a highly trained skald or a learned audience member. So, to translate, the strong ice sheet, that is, an axe or sword, of Rhodes, that is, a sea king, roof, a shield, does not diminish because of the reign of the eyes, that is, tears or weeping, of Od's bedmate, which is Freya, and her weeping is gold. May that king reach old age. Simple, right? Yeah, I know. Although most Skaldic poetry is riddle-like and indirect with its treatment of Norse mythology, since the king or event being praised or commemorated is more important, there are a few earlier examples, as far as we can tell, that are much more direct. 3 are particularly interesting because scholars refer to them as Eddic praise poetry, because they actually use Eddic meters and mythological imagery to praise recently deceased kings. The most famous of those examples is probably the anonymous Eriksmal. Besides those examples, however, poets have occasionally described mythological imagery on shields, such as in Ragnarsdrapa by Bragi the Old, in halls, such as Husdrapa by Ulf Uggason, and recounted mythological stories with more complex, ornate verse, such as Thorsdrapa by Eilif Guldranason. Thor is the most common mythological figure to appear in Skaldic poetry, and this is especially true for poetry coming from, or set in, the time of Icelandic conversion, roughly 1000 CE. A great example of that comes from a woman named Steinunn, who was Ref the poet's mother. Thor drove Thingbrand's beast of Thinvinil far from its place. He shook and shattered the ship and slammed it ashore. Never will that oak of Atal's field be up to seafaring again. The storm, sent by him, smashed it so hard into bits. The problem still remains, however, that most of these poems, just like Eddic poetry, weren't actually written down in the Viking Age. They were, after all, designed to be orally performed before an audience, such as the king's court. There is some runic poetry from the Viking Age, and the example from Åland, roughly 1000 CE, is notable, but the vast majority of what we have was preserved in later medieval manuscripts, over 500 of them in fact. Nevertheless, some have argued that the rigorous rules of Skaldic poetry have helped preserve its form over time, while others have argued otherwise, sometimes with great vigor. Personally, my preferred stance is in the middle, to accept that this poetry contains genuine fragments of old lore, but they are presented in a form and for a purpose that is unique to its new, later context. So if you ever find yourself relying on Skaldic poetry for knowledge about Norse mythology, or even for guidance on your religious path, make sure you consider the context of the source it was preserved in as well.